During the later years of the PlayStation's lifespan, you would begin to see many games being released that would be considered to be very lackluster in their approach, as a lot of companies, mainly committees, would also be trying to capitalise off trends from TV programmes, cartoons, movies, all to try and pretty much make a quick buck. And what would end up happening is you would get a lot of games, kind of like in many cases even shovelware games as they're more commonly known, where they would just try to capitalise to make a quick buck. Some of them would have some distinctive ideas but just wouldn't be well executed, or in many cases many games would try to be a one size fits all but just wouldn't appeal to anybody. And there would be a lot of these games that would see out the remaining years of the PlayStation, which is quite a shame when you think about it, when you look at the lasting legacy that the PlayStation has at its disposal. But the same thing happened with the likes of the PlayStation 2. Like, make no mistake, the PlayStation 2 may be the best selling console of all time, but it also has its equal amount and fair share, if not more, shovelware games or low quality games that were being released. It was ridiculous the amount of low budget and low quality games that were being released on that system, even more than the PS1 in many regards, which is unfortunate to say the least, but that's just a reflection of its time. And that would also set the precedents for future consoles, and even today when you look at the indie realm of games. Yes, in many cases a lot of these games towards the later years of the console's lifespan, both with the PlayStation and PlayStation 2, these games also presented an avenue for many developers to really get their foot in the door to start developing games. But unfortunately they'd already set the trend of creating games that had some distinctive elements but they were considered low quality, and that kind of was the way things would move forward with them. Only the high-end budget companies like Capcom, Konami and that would still be pushing out high quality titles, but everything else that came after it just many ways fell to the wayside. No longer were these games seen as experimental, they were all literally just quick cash grabs, or they were just kind of iterations on projects that had been seen before it. They try and just make a quick buck and move on to the next project. You've seen that with a lot of games. If we look at the likes of games like the All-Star Racing series, 5-Star Racing, if you look at those series of games, plus there was a lot of spin-off games or even elements taken from those compilations that were also sold as individual titles. Like that there was a perfect example of just rehashing and reusing the same game concepts, assets, ideas, levels, and just in a way to make a quick buck and move on. Like, there was no originality behind those games when you think about it. Yes, they did have some decent graphics, but they didn't offer anything new. They were totally limited. They felt like overly long or expanded demos rather than full games in many regards, which is a pity. But in saying that, one of the games that we will be looking at here is by the name of Tonka Space Station. If you've ever gone back to the earlier years of when we were growing up as kids, there's a very good chance that many of us for Christmas would have ended up having a lot of toys from this well-known brand, like from diggers to cranes, tractors, and all sorts of heavy-duty machinery. Like, I know myself personally because I had 4 brothers, and when we were all young, many of us woke up on Christmas morning to a lot of these type of toys which we would play with for ages and had great fun with them. So it was always inevitable that video games would always try to capitalise on these popular and distinctive brands, but unfortunately the games would never capitalise on the real thing as such. So with Tonka Space Station, you take on the role of a character that's being told pretty much what to do from Tonka Joe, where you have to complete a variety of different missions all within space that takes you around different levels, that tries to contribute to a variety of different arcade and simulation style modes, where you can be doing anything from shooting enemies in space or in tunnels to drilling holes in walls, racing on race tracks. It tries to be everything and tries to be a one size fits all, but at the same time also feels very lackluster in terms of how it presents itself, because the game is clearly aimed at kids but doesn't contribute to the same elements of games that were being developed at that time. Like, you had games like Spyro the Dragon, there was the Crash Bandicoot games, among many others, that appealed to that dynamic, that yes, they were difficult but that they were of better quality. Whereas you had games that played like this, where in many cases some of the levels were overly simplistic but yet others were at the same time quite complicated, and they weren't really distinctive in what it was that you had to do in them. So it left for a lot of confusion. So when I said it was a one size fits all, that's exactly what it was trying to be, because it's so many different gameplay styles. It was really hard to nail down exactly what this game was supposed to be. I suppose it did have some interesting ideas but just wasn't really well thought out of, and and that also reflected in the game's reviews. It is a game that's reflective of its time period, as the game got abysmal reviews really, and stating back to what I said, the game really didn't know what it was trying to be. It was trying to be everything, but yet didn't appeal to really anybody. It was a racing game, it was a shooting game, it was like a compilation of different ideas, and I suppose when you think about it, some kids would have gotten some fun out of it to a certain degree, but it would have also been left very simplistic, because it is very linear, it is very restricted in how it presents itself, even with the levels. There's very little you can do, there's no exploration, you literally just have tasks you need to complete. You have to collect a certain amount of items or objects, get to point A or point B, or complete a certain amount of laps in a race, and that's pretty much it throughout each of the levels. So it is very, very limited in what it tries to do, and in many cases can be a little bit confusing, but can also feel like a grind as well in order to complete the game. In many cases you'll find that most people will just literally turn the game off and go on to play something else before long, which is a pity, because the game does have very distinctive ideas, but it's too overly simplistic for what it's trying to do. If it had been more focused in what it was trying to represent, and it actually had a proper story around it, then yeah, you could understand what it would have been like. But I suppose it was just a game that just came out probably at the wrong time. Yes, if this game had been released probably earlier on in the PlayStation's lifespan, say within 95, 96, this game might have fared a little bit better, because even at that time games were going through a very experimental process, and if anything this game would have appealed to that nature back then more so than anything. But by the time the year 2000 rolled around, we were on the verge of getting the PlayStation 2 that year, so games that were coming out, it would have had to really stand out, because in the space of only 5 or 6 years people's opinions, demands, interests and expectations had completely changed in the whole landscape of gaming. Because in the space of only 2 or 3 years, from the point of 1995 to 1998, there were so many games that came out on the PlayStation that they literally became trendsetters and literally entirely changed the games industry outright as how we perceived games that we were going to play in the future. And the problem is that anything that came after that would never really fit that standard. So for a lot of those games, in many ways, right, they did have decent ideas, but I think they're a victim of their time, that they came out at the wrong time. Had they been released years prior to that, during the early months and years of the PlayStation's launch, they definitely would have fared a lot better. But unfortunately that was the case. Many of these games were just left by the wayside, they didn't sell well, they just didn't appeal to audiences as much, because in many ways, like even with kids, even though this game was aimed at that, parents would probably be thinking to themselves, why would we buy this when we could buy the likes of Crash Bandicoot, we could buy Spyro the Dragon. You had the latest Crash Bandicoot game, which was Crash Bandicoot 3 Warped at that point. You had Spyro the Dragon, and you had a load of other games as well that would have been more appealing to gamers of that type and that generation. The only way this would have really appealed is if you managed to find it at a bargain bin for a couple of dollars, if you were getting it cheap. Like even today, if you were to get it, you'd probably only get it just added to your collection if you're a collector for these type of games. But other than that, you wouldn't spend big money on it, nor would you want to, unfortunately. It is what it is, that's just the way games were, it's the way consoles were, and especially even with today, when you see a lot of consoles coming out towards the end of the lifespan, things start to hit a rapid decline. The quality of games that start to come out on them does be very lackluster at best, to say the least. Like the PlayStation 1 and especially the PlayStation 2 is definitely living proof of that, which is a pity in many regards. It is what it is, but aside from that, I would love to know your thoughts of Tonka Space Station for the PlayStation 1, if you have played it yourself, and what did you think of it overall? Did you find this game enjoyable, or did you find the game just to be a bit lackluster in many areas and a bit too simplistic? Or is it just a victim of its time being released? So be sure to share it down in the comments below. And if you would like to see more content around other types of unusual and quirky games like this that were also released on the PlayStation, then you can check out the videos on screen and even look at some of the other videos I've already covered on the channel to see more of them in action. And as always, keep those gaming memories alive.